Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. Together we dive into the world of sci-fi and science fiction. From episodes of Star Trek, Star Wars, to The Walking Dead, Resident Evil, all the hot new science fiction movies from the back doors of Marvel or DC. The Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. You'll never look at science fiction the same way again.
Welcome back to the GSMC Sci-Fi Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. My name is Keith. I am your podcast host for today. I also host this podcast on Sundays, and on Sundays for the last couple months, I think since June, we've been talking about Hyperion, or maybe April, May? I'm not totally sure. I went through and looked at the catalog the other day and was like, oh, that's not as far back as I thought it was. I thought we started talking about Hyperion in like February, but we didn't start talking about it until a little bit later, until after COVID hit. So, but that was when I started getting into audiobooks and realized that I could get through an 800-page book in a matter of months rather than in a matter of years. As a reader, I have a tendency to read like 5 or 6 books at the same time over the course of 2 to 3 years. It took me 2.5 years to read American Psycho, and I just read it in conjunction with a book on Christian philosophy and then another regular philosophy book. I'm still reading a Nietzsche book that's been taking me almost 5 years to finish. So I just kind of hold all that data in my head, like somewhat simultaneously as I slowly grind through different things. So, you know, is what it is. I definitely really enjoy it and enjoy reading, and audiobooks have been a great outlet for that for me. So I would recommend them in general, though I would recommend taking notes. I frequently do that. There's something about reading words on a page that is just a little bit, I guess, better than listening to them. When we were reading Hyperion, there's been frequent instances of them referencing the fact that most of the people in the future are illiterate because they can just listen to or absorb or have data directly implanted into their minds. So the need to actually read an analog book is pretty much non-existent. So, yeah. And on the note of future, potentially dystopian worlds, this week I have decided to finally undertake a novel that I've been looking at reading for years. A lot of you had to read it in high school. So if you have people who are reading this in high school and you think they might glean something interesting to write an essay about, I would definitely recommend that you check out, or send them this podcast rather. Other than that, yeah, I guess I should tell you what book it is. It's Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. It's going to be my first time reading a Huxley book, actually, which is surprising because he has a fairly broad spectrum, broad catalog, I guess. Broad catalog of work would be the right way to phrase that. He was a writer in like I want to say like early 20th century. I know that Brave New World was published originally in 1932, so I am sure that there will be plenty of things that we look at from this novel where the conclusion might be, oh, it's no wonder he was so terrified of this particular thing. It was 1920 some odd when he started writing this book. So for those of you who don't know, who haven't read Brave New World is basically like a future dystopian novel that focuses on like a specific society and an individual or a few individuals who interact with like different parts of that society. I think one of the main characters is going to be named, or is Bernard Marx. I'm only in chapter 2, but chapter 1 had more than enough in it for me to just kind of think I could almost spend the full amount of time talking about that exclusively. So, that's where we're at. But basically, Brave New World is set in what would be 2540, so about 520 years from now. But the novel identifies it as the year 632 AF, and AF stands for after Ford, because in this novel, the assembly line, which is created by Henry Ford to manufacture the Model T, is kind of revered as like almost a religious practice in some capacities. This, it's very clear in the first chapter that the basis of this society is rooted in the ideas of utilitarianism without any like libertarian ideals shaping it. It's kind of, I guess the best way to phrase it would say it's kind of like a communist or socialist utilitarianism that removes the idea of individuality as an intrinsic aspect of an individual's experience of it. And the reason that they remove the individuality from the situation is because they believe it to be more utilitous to the like overall success of the human race. This is kind of similar. It's kind of similar in there was a movie that we just watched. Ooh, the name of it is just escaping me. I can't remember it exactly. But basically, there is this idea of, we were talking about it in Hyperion, not in a movie. I apologize. So it does a similar thing to Hyperion, where it takes this idea of the medieval belief in the divine chain of being and then applies that in a utilitarian way to a future society. So one of the main aspects of this society is that there are different tropic levels of individuals based off of how it is that they are bred, would be the right way to, or would be one way to phrase it. The other way would be the way that they're not synthesized per se. Cloned might be a more accurate way to describe it. So in this particular society, and in the very first chapter of the book, they are the main character is receiving a tour of the facilities at which human beings are cloned and multiplied. Now, I'm not that far into the book, so I don't know if people are still actually like doing the reproductive process in an analog fashion, though I would doubt it, because according to the guy who runs the factory, the majority of the females that they make are impotent or barren, so they cannot bear children. So my guess is that generally, in the same way that Henry Ford built a capitalist system on the idea of manufacturing cars, there were individuals who decided to capitalize on the process of reproduction and are essentially artificially cornering that market by making individuals who can't reproduce. And part of what's terrifying about this is that we are looking to do this to mosquitoes. There was a study that's been done, or there's a study that's been done several times where, they've looked at the environmental impact of mosquitoes and decided that they needed to either like eliminate them from an area or drastically reduce their population numbers. And the easiest way to do that was to release a bunch of larvae from barren female mosquitoes. So you basically get like a large spike in population for about a month, well, not even a month, probably like a week. And then after that week, there's no mosquitoes left, or there's almost no mosquitoes left because 95% of the viable mates are all barren. So that's part of why it's such a terrifying concept, is because it's really not all that far off from what it is that humans are doing to animals. It's just a matter of time before humans start viewing each other in that particular capacity. And the reason that they view them in that particular capacity in this novel is because of these tropic levels that I was mentioning earlier. So there are several different levels to society, and I think they're called alphas, betas, gammas, deltas, and epsilons. And that is the order in which they are valued. So alphas are at the top of the chain, epsilons are at the bottom of the chain. That makes sense because it's like a descending Greek alphabet thing. So in this particular society, the companies that have learned to capitalize off of the reproductive process have factories where they will take embryos that they've acquired. They haven't exactly stated how they acquire the embryos just yet, or the spermatozoa, as Huxley so diplomatically puts it. They haven't really told us where they get those things just yet, so it's kind of hard for us to know exactly how it is that they're going about acquiring the raw materials necessary for the process. But they take those raw materials and they will turn one embryo or one, fertilized egg into up to 96 or 92 individual people. It may have been 96. I apologize. That would make sense based off of, 92 would make sense because it's based off of the number of chromosomes that individuals have. I can't remember if individuals have 46 or 48 chromosomes. I apologize. Regardless, I'm pretty sure it's double the number of human chromosomes available within the cells that result from meiosis, which is the egg and the spermatozoa. So, not to use, I think those are PG words on this podcast, just adding the atazoa at the end of it, I guess. Regardless, the companies seem to take pride in their ability to create as many human beings from one embryo as possible. And the human beings that are created during this process are heavily manipulated by a number of other processes. So, for instance, there are certain eggs in individuals that are taken, and as they are gestating, they become accustomed to a certain level of heat or a certain level of cold based off of where it is that they might be needed. Because what is kind of not been mentioned in this particular, or yet in this novel, is that the world is governed by one governing body. And everybody within the governing body is kind of like subject to. Now, the book says everybody else, and that's kind of like everyone is beholden to everyone. The quote, I think, is everyone belongs to everyone else. And that's kind of like their catchphrase, though I'm not necessarily certain that that's going to be super applicable. I wouldn't be surprised in the end of this novel, like, reveals that the people who believe themselves to be alphas or some ancient person. Like I said, I haven't read this book before, so you've read it before. No spoilers, but that some, ancient person or ancient organization is using this process to maintain power. That would be one way in which Huxley would be able to show us how scary this particular future is, though I don't think he's going to need it, because just in the first, chapter, just in the first few paragraphs, the way in which Huxley is able to depict this reproductive, and I say that with air quotes, process, is terrifying, objectively. I love Fahrenheit 451. It's been my favorite, I guess, totalitarian, gosh darn it. Totalitarian, why am I not remembering the word? Starts with a U. Dystopia, there we go. Has been my favorite, totalitarian dystopian novel. Just based off of the first chapter of this book, I have a feeling that that notion will be challenged, just because I think that this represents, in some capacities, a little bit more imminent of a threat. I'm not so necessarily worried about people being not allowed to read, because they'll actively choose to not do that. So why bother with burning books if people choose not to read them? I'm more worried about, if I were to think about what's most likely for general society, the slow and atrocious process of indoctrination into the belief that we would all be better off if we were all working towards the same common goal. And that's not necessarily untrue, but I think that the result of doing that is kind of what Huxley is going to look to examine in this novel. So we're going to keep talking about Brave New World. That'll be right after this quick commercial break.
Want to find out what movies to go see? Then check out the GSMC Movie Podcast. It's your ticket to the latest movies, whether it's a new blockbuster event, romantic, comedy, or action flick. This show has got it all covered. They talk some what to go see now. Don't bother. What's hot on Netflix and everything in between. That's gsmcpodcast.com/movie-podcast. When it's all about the movies, it has to be this new show. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit gsmcpodcast.com for more info.
We were kind of talking about what it is that makes Brave New World's premise so scary. Yeah. I mean, among other things. We were talking about a lot of stuff. But in this particular regard, or in this the interest of this particular thing, I suppose, we were kind of talking about the process by which reproduction is achieved in Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. That's what the first chapter is focused on pretty heavily. And I think that part of what Huxley is trying to do with the way that he's handling this is lay out his ontology for the understanding of the ways in which humanity operates. I think that, like I had specifically mentioned, that Huxley talked about how during the manufacturing process of human beings, which is to say the gestation process that occurs in these factories, during that process, if you expose a fetus to heat and then cold, that you will persuade the fetus to be acclimated to hotter climates before it's even born. So it will have a desire to go, as the book says, work in the tropics as a miner, because it will believe that that is the best way for it to achieve happiness, because some core part of its being will be acclimated to the environment of the tropics and of a mining, like a mining career. So it's used to hot, cramped places, and then it hates the cold, so it's not going to want to stick around where it is that they're manufacturing these human beings, I guess, because they're in London. And one specific thing that they mention, which, Huxley's from a very different time, so take this for what it is, but he specifically mentions the idea of how people of other races' embryos are easier to work with, or will solicit more human beings from one process. They talk about specifically the idea that at their factory they've been able to get 15,000 or 16,000 individuals from one embryo. So each time that embryo has been divided and fertilized, or divided and developed rather, because I think an embryo would already be fertilized. I'm not entirely sure about the process here. But each time that it goes through the initial process, which the name of which I can't remember, but it's got some fancy name that Huxley made up that is probably based off of a philosopher or a scientist that I'm not familiar with, because Huxley was writing this in the 1920s and 30s. Regardless, the process basically is that an egg and a spermatozoa are fused together happenstantially in an environment that kind of synthesizes the natural environment in which that would occur. And then from there, they select the most optimized, embryo. So yeah, the embryo would be the fertilized, the result of a fertilized egg. And they select the most optimized version of that, and all of the other ones that are, close enough to or exactly the same level of optimization. And then they will put those into a process during which they'll be put under an extreme amount of stress, like in a similar way to how humans have figured out the balance of giving plants water or exposing them to heat to force them to multiply faster. For instance, if you grow tomatoes, if you don't water them every day, you'll get a lot more fruit from them because the plant will think, oh, I'm dying, I need to work harder to produce more. So what they actually will do is make the fertilized egg, as it starts to divide, nearly die. And then when it comes back, it will naturally split into more fertilized, viable eggs / human beings. And then all of those specimens are collected and develop individually in their own, I guess, test tube. I don't really know exactly how it is that Huxley says, or where it is that Huxley says that these things develop. And I probably shouldn't call them things because they are technically human beings, but like, are they? Not totally sure. So, yeah, there's that. But Huxley is writing about this process in the 30s. I already mentioned that. I don't know why. Sorry. So the human eggs, they undergo this process. They divide into multiple things or multiple human beings. And the characters in the book are already talking about how, it's so primitive that in previous iterations of human reproduction, we were only able to get twins happenstantially. We couldn't like target that goal. We would need to, they need to target that goal in the reproductive process. They can't just have it happen. It happened happenstantially previously, which they just feel is not an indicator for success in the process, because a big thing for them is consistency and their ability to do things in a certain way. There's even a character that Huxley specifically mentions as being proud of and getting pleasure from spouting off random facts or random figures to people, which is just kind of sad that would be a thing. It's definitely not ideal as far as developing real human beings is concerned. But it is ideal in the sense that Huxley's novel is, he's specifically outlining what it is that he thinks makes human beings or influences human beings. And so I think that there's like this weird sense of a commercialized spirituality or spiritualized aspect of the gestational process, because I don't think that there's ever really been scientists who would say that the conditions under which you gestate are going to be those which you have a high proclivity for. So in some regard, Huxley, in my opinion, is saying that there is a subconscious communication that happens between the gestating individual and the world around them in some capacity. So there's a mind at work in any creature that has a mind, so much so that you can even influence it based off of different stimulus. And we haven't even gotten to the process that creates the alphas or even the betas. We were just looking at what creates the gammas, the deltas, and the epsilons, especially the epsilons, because what is kind of true is that they've removed the valuation system that we have as individuals, where certain people are viewed as being greater than. It's like the epitome of an epsilon is just as desirable as the epitome of an alpha in this particular in this particular novel, because ultimately everybody is just designed to serve a specific purpose. They are not designed to fulfill a purpose that they decide on for themselves. The purpose that they are supposed to serve is instilled in them literally before they can even open their eyes. So that is kind of like what Huxley, I think, is implying with this book, is that like there is a form of predestination that is scientifically achievable if we could understand completely the gestational process that human fetuses go through, I guess would be the way to phrase that. If we could have a better understanding of how it is that humans gestate, then we might be able to do this particular thing. And if you're looking at like the way that science is evolving now, there are a lot of things as far as the gestational process that we can do that are predictors of really, I guess, interesting things would be the best way to phrase it. You can get a test done that will tell you what sports your child is most likely to be successful at based off of genetic markers that scientists have studied in different athletes who play different sports. And that is like really cool, and I would totally do it for my, future children if I can afford it. But it's also really terrifying in some regards. And I think that this idea or a similar idea is what Huxley is saying is terrifying, especially if you think about this from the perspective of somebody who's writing this in the 1920s, when they like barely have an understanding of science compared to what we have now, and they barely have an understanding of genetics, where like really the idea of genetics having an influence on the outcome of someone's life is going to be like only just have been proposed. Like psychology is barely a thing at this point. They're still looking at emotions through a philosophic lens and a metaphysic lens rather than looking at them through a psychological lens. So it's just kind of terrifying to think that the psyche of a human being could be so easily manipulated just based off of how warm or cold it was when they were gestating. And then another part of the process that I mentioned kind of earlier that Huxley goes into a great deal of detail about is the process of ensuring that only a certain number of the cloned human beings can actually viably reproduce. There's a bunch of discussion about like the hormone baths and specifically how much testosterone is given to each group. It seems that they, they create more men than women just because the main purpose of a lot of the reproductive process for them is to create people who are ideal in a specific role. And based off of the understanding that Huxley would have had at the time, his assumption would probably be that role was going to be best fulfilled by like mostly men. So, I'm not here to apologize for Huxley by any means, but we have to remember that people are kind of a product of their time in some regard. So Huxley is naturally very skewed towards the idea of physical labor being completed by men, and this specific factory is kind of making a lot of individuals who are destined to work in the mines in the tropics. There's several mentions of the tropics, so I'm sure that will come into play later. But the overall process, I think, is just, again, Huxley setting out the premise that he has for this world where people have gained enough understanding about the way in which human development occurs that they can manipulate that development to solicit a specific result that they've believed to be desirable in a way that they would never have been able to do previously. And that's part of what's so terrifying about it and why this chapter was so scary to me, because I was just thinking that, Huxley writes this in 1932 or writes this in the late 1920s and the early 1930s. And it's all based off of the idea that not all of it, but substantial portion of it's based off of the idea that the assembly line is this like echelon of human efficiency and human power and success. And if you were to apply that principle to the manufacture of humans, it's kind of terrifying. So I'm not necessarily sure what economic system or anything like that Huxley is looking to advocate for, or whether he's even lambasting an economic system, but we'll talk about that right after this next quick commercial break.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
I was kind of briefly summarizing where it is that Aldous Huxley might fall on the, philosophy of economics in some regard. I'm not necessarily sure, as I've very briefly have just barely started this book. Just really am dipping my toes into the water of it. I'm not exactly sure what it is that Huxley is going to be saying specifically throughout the novel, but just based off of the premise that he's setting forth in the beginning of this book, I would say that it's kind of like a common trope, if you will, in a number of different ways. So first off, I want to mention that specifically Huxley is under the impression that a homogeneous society is one that will solicit an outcome in which individuality is squashed. So his implication is that and this is part of why the idea of cloning is so terrifying, is that individuals who are all just derivatives of the same genetic material are going to have the same proclivities and want to interact with the world all in very similar fashions and in ways that are, I'm just reiterating myself 3 times. I sound like a bad politician. But they're going to all interact with the world in a similar fashion. And they'll have similar beliefs and conclusions about that world because of the proclivities created by the homogeneous reproduction of individuals via a highly refined utilitarian system of human manufacturing. Now, I don't know if this book gets into this idea at all, though I'm interested if it does. But, how is it that you arrive at a situation in which the human reproductive process has been overtaken by a corporation, or in this particular case, I think it would be by the government, because if I'm understanding correctly, the big premise of this book is that it's kind of like a socialist type thing, really more communist, but kind of like a socialist type thing where the government owns the means of production in all cases. So it's a government-run facility that is the one reproducing human beings, as far as I can tell. Which, to me, the implication there would be that at some point it was a private institution that was doing this, and then it became something that was acquired by the government as a part of their desire to, do population control or something like that. There is reference to the fact that they're attempting to repopulate certain parts of the world, which to me might imply that there was some sort of great war that is the thing that unified everybody, or maybe there's some mention of because this is right after, relatively soon after World War I, and one of the big things that individuals who have lived through or witnessed or have direct relatives who are a part of large-scale wars is that it pretty heavily influences their writing style. Lord of the Rings is a great example of this. For those of you who don't know, J.R.R. Tolkien was actually a cavalryman in World War I. So he actually rode a horse in World War I, which is pretty intense. And Tolkien wrote Lord of the Rings. There's a lot of specific types of experiences that you would find in that book that are probably from war, just as I would imagine a lot of the interactions and the ways in which the world concludes in this particular fashion will be a result of the war. Because if you look at historically what is heaviest on people's minds is this idea that technology is simultaneously terrifying and also hugely beneficial. So if you're looking at the casualties of World War I, they're substantially greater than any other war that has occurred up to that point. I don't know the numbers on other wars afterwards, but what happened specifically in World War I, and this is kind of one of the major differences between World War I and World War II, is that in World War I there was a ton of casualties on the part of military. In World War II, the Germans kind of discovered that they can bomb civilians a little bit more frequently, and like civilian populations start becoming victim to these technologies. But in the First World War, it's kind of the result of a bunch of pent-up technological questions that individuals had about, like, well, how fast can a machine gun really fire? What happens when you fire a giant explosive, in a huge arc into an enemy encampment? What do we do with toxic gas that we know can immediately kill people or things? And like trench warfare is a vestigial aspect of warfare that occurred with like muskets and bayonets, because it used to be that a trench was a very valuable defensive position, but now you get these huge gaps of no man's land where there's just mortar shells being wantonly shot across these giant expanses, and then these individuals who think that, they're going to win some glory by charging from one trench into the enemy trench and taking individuals out in order to advance their position, geographically, not like advance their position in the military, though I'm sure that was a part of it. But there's this idea that you're going to be able to use these old tactics in a way that is going to solicit success in the same way that it used to. But the problem is that you're going over the top of a trench and running towards a trench that has 2 machine guns in it. So 2 men can shoot down like an entire group of 50 to even 100 people just with 1 machine gun. And that is absolutely unprecedented. And so this idea of technology being something that individuals ought to fear is somewhat fresh in the minds of what's called the lost generation. And those are all the individuals who were 18 and 19 when World War I occurred. And so they would have been in their early 30s by the time that Huxley had published A Brave New World. So I think that if you look at just the landscape of the world in which Huxley was living, especially in Britain — Huxley is a British author, if I remember correctly, or even in America if he was an American author, or wherever else he could have possibly been from. If you're looking like at the landscape that he's operating in, then of course he's going to be kind of presenting technology as this simultaneous, as this horrifying thing. One of the big things of the modernist movement, which is the general literary movement at the turn of the 20th century or in the early 1900s, it's the idea that progress isn't really progress, it's just difference. It's kind of what lays the groundwork or the framework for postmodernism in some capacities, and existentialism, because basically what it says is like, well, your perception of things as being progressive is only your perception of them being progressive. It's not the general perception of everybody else. If we look at something from a different viewpoint, then it becomes abundantly obvious that that's not necessarily advantageous. As an individual existing in the 21st century, when I read, oh, we've been able to figure out how to essentially clone one embryo into 15,000 people, and all 15,000 of those people are perfectly conditioned for the exact purpose that they were bred for, it doesn't sound advantageous to me. It sounds horrifying. It sounds like a violation of an individual's free will to expose a fetus to certain environmental factors to subconsciously convince them to do a specific task as they become an adult. That just seems backwards. It seems improper in some capacities. So I'm not entirely sure how you would have viewed it in the 1930s, but I would imagine it would be something similar. It's a pretty drastic violation of the necessity for free will in individuals' lives. And the fact that it can be so flagrantly disregarded is absolutely terrifying, in my opinion. And I don't think that it would have been a very different sentiment to what would have been expressed when people originally read this book. And that lines up with the idea that, and because in the book, the gentleman who runs the factory, or the gentleman who's giving the tour, says, look how this is so much progress. Look how efficient this is. Look how, look at the beauty in the scientific and clinical way by which we can train and influence the development of human beings prior to their even being born. And I would say born in air quotes because they don't exactly experience real birth, is viewed as like this powerful thing of progress, because the basis of their like spiritual understanding of the world is that it ought to be optimized and controlled by like man's will and man as like or human's will rather, and it ought to be controlled in that way, in a way that is most beneficial for the largest number of people. So the suppression of a few thousand individuals as they are brought into this world is irrelevant in reference to the fact that the entire rest of the human population that already exists, that already has cognizance, is going to experience much more prosperity, because individuals are shaped into the thing that it is that they're destined to become according to what the world needs them to be. And in that same fashion, those people who are fulfilling that role will be satisfied because they were subconsciously, they were, I don't even know if you could say tricked. They were just created with this purpose, and they'll feel fulfilled in fulfilling that purpose. So an epsilon will feel good about being an epsilon. An alpha will feel good about being an alpha. The society that Huxley is laying out is one of like complete and total acceptance. In the same way, it's like a weaponized version of the idea of the great chain of being, which is an old medieval thing that, you are born to your status according to like the way that God intended for you to be born. If you are a peasant, it's because God intended for you to be a peasant, and you should be happy in your peasanthood because you're fulfilling the purpose that God made for you. It's essentially, it was laid out by monarchy as a way to affirm the idea that they should be the monarchy. God placed them in power, and therefore their family, as they continued to have power, would have been placed divinely to have that power. And so why would you, when you go against the king, you're now not only going against the king, but you're going against God. And because of that, it becomes even less advantageous for individuals to believe that they ought to have some sort of mobility within a social structure. And so this is kind of like a futuristic, weaponized version of that, where Huxley has removed God from the equation, and instead of saying Santa Claus will be upset with you if you disobey the king, he says there is no Santa Claus, or instead he says Santa Claus has made you to obey the king, and you don't even know it. And that is kind of like one of the most terrifying aspects of the book, is that everything's kind of predestined in some sort of like fatalistic Greek drama type of way. And nobody is even really aware of it except for like the people who get the tour of the reproductive facility. Because like obviously the people who are touring this facility are going to understand, and they have questions about like, oh, how great is this, a super efficient process, and they're gung-ho about it. And, excited about it in some regards even. And they're totally fine with the fact that this is the way that things are. But I haven't seen how it is that the alphas are brought up. I wouldn't be surprised if the alphas are treated in a way to where they have some sort of like free will. And that the argument that Huxley is making is that individuals who have kind of like a more happenstantial or have more volition over the way in which their lives go, if he's going to advocate that those types of people are going to be like the epitome of what it is to be human. One of the main characters in this is an alpha in the book. I am curious if that's part of where the colloquialism like alpha and beta males comes from. I would doubt it, but I'm just curious, because it would be funny that such a bro reference came from like this weird, obscure, I wouldn't call it obscure, but this weird science fiction book that came out in the early 1900s. But regardless, a lot of what Huxley, if that's the case, then a lot of what Huxley has to say is going to line up with another philosopher who we've mentioned numerous times throughout the podcast. And I will talk about that right after this next commercial break.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blank and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
Got another 15 minutes or so to talk about the first couple chapters of Brave New World. Now, right before the break, I had mentioned that I was going to talk about somebody who I talk about frequently, and I am going to do exactly that. And I apologize for it in some regard, but not in all regards. The person, or the philosopher that I'm going to talk about is Nietzsche. As we all know, I love Nietzsche. I happen to think that he is one of the best thinkers of the 20th century. As well as I think he was technically writing in the 19th century. Not totally sure. He would not have. Oh, actually, technically, he did not write in the 20th century at all. Nietzsche died in 1900. I forgot that he died, a relatively young man. Born in 1844, died in 1900, which is unfortunate. Actually, his death was yesterday, was the 120 years from his death. But he influenced a lot of people. He is kind of the father of existentialism, which is a system of philosophy that I subscribe pretty heavily to personally, and that I find a lot of value in. So, I highly recommend pretty much everything it is that he's ever written. But that's neither here nor there. The reason that I bring him up is because there's this idea... and I'm not sure if Huxley would have been aware of this at the during which he was writing, but potentially there's this idea that was proposed by Nietzsche called the Übermensch. And the Übermensch was essentially this concept that Nietzsche kind of came up with to talk about what it looked like to be an actualized human who could apply values into the world. A lot of Nietzsche's arguments rely on these ideas of like a juxtaposition of old ways with new ways. His big thing that he's well known for is the line, we have killed God and there's not enough water to wash the blood out. And the idea of that statement isn't necessarily, and I've said this before on the podcast, isn't necessarily that God is dead, and since that God doesn't exist, it's more along the lines of like, well, we have created all of this science, specifically like the ideas of evolution and other things, that basically can say the world exists without God. So now that we don't have God as an appeal, a universal appeal that's acknowledged within the ideas of like building moral systems, what is it that we are responsible for doing? And the thing that kind of separates in the idea of the Übermensch from like general society, Nietzsche has a lot of ideas on like power and the way that power dynamics work. That's part of how things are given or allotted value in his system. And so for Nietzsche, I guess one of the important things, and the reason I'm bringing this up, the idea of the genius is something that Nietzsche not only Nietzsche talked about, but also Kierkegaard, who wrote around a similar time, if I remember correctly. I know a lot of philosophy authors, but I don't necessarily know what time they're ascribed to, which is funny. But I think that kind of Huxley is maybe in some ways portraying this idea in like a hyperbolic sense, because the idea of the genius is that they're set apart in some capacity in such a dramatic way that it becomes blatantly apparent that this person exists in a different way than everybody else does. And because of their existence in juxtaposition to everybody else, they are able to allot more meaningful value to the things around them in more important ways. So, well, more important, that's relative, in ways that Nietzsche felt were more meaningful, more intellectually consistent. And if we're talking about like the tropic levels of individuals within the society, which we are, then the alphas are set aside in some regard and like given like special treatments and things like that to make them into like nearly perfect beings. And they exist with like knowledge that is separate or an extended version of the knowledge that everybody else has. I would guess that the group of people who is being given this tour is all made up of alphas, is all made up of these people who are at the highest echelon as far as the divisions of like power and hierarchy are concerned within A Brave New World. And the reason that I'm bringing this idea up is because I think that Huxley is going to portray this idea that individuals who are given the opportunity to like succeed to a maximal effect are never going to be satisfied with living according to a status quo. So in the way that like betas, gammas, deltas, and epsilons are all made to be satisfied by the fact that they are those things, these alphas are going to ultimately be dissatisfied in some regard because they as individuals are going to exist in a capacity that they cannot be fulfilled, because to be a genius means to be constantly unfulfilled. The best example of like this in Nietzsche is going to be Thus Spoke Zarathustra, which is kind of like I guess you could call it a satire in some ways. It's like an Aristotelian satire on the ideas of the Pilgrim's Progress, where all of the names and things are all direct allegoric or like literal references to what it is that the person or the thing is doing. So there's like a seeker and a guru, I think, or like shaman might be what Nietzsche calls him. But basically it's this pilgrim's journey to enlightenment without the presence of God, because enlightenment comes from like the knowledge of the way that things exist in the world. And that's going to be something that I think Huxley, moving forward in his book, is going to portray pretty heavily. There's going to be, in my opinion, if I had to guess, a lot of juxtaposition between like the satisfaction that individuals who are of these lower classes, who are conditioned at birth to be satisfied with their stature. There's going to be a lot of juxtaposition between that and the alpha, who is kind of like trying to seek more out of life than just to fulfill his role. So, having never read the book before, there's a lot of, predictions that I will probably be making as we go throughout it. You'll just have to forgive me if you have read the book and kind of go along for the ride, if you will. Overall, I know that I spent a lot of time talking about this first chapter, but I really felt that it was important to spend a lot of time on it, because I think just from the way it's written, you can tell that Huxley finds it to be very important. It kind of establishes the setting in a way that shows us rather than tells us what's important to the individuals who are the active players in the story. The ideas within society seem to be incredibly utilitarian in a way that is almost inhuman, because the value of human life has been reduced to kind of like a controllable commodity in a way that is like ultimately really horrifying. And I think that, a lot of people, or a lot of writers who are writing, George Orwell is going to be writing sometime soon after this as well. A lot of these writers who are writing these dystopian novels, they're kind of taking a look at society around them and technology around them and thinking in some capacity that some aspect of society has intrinsically changed, or that like the way humans interact with the world is going to intrinsically change based off of certain other occurrences, other occurrences brought on by technology. So for Huxley, what he saw was this idea of like a very consumer-focused, capitalist-focused, efficiency-focused, utilitarian idea of the assembly line, where every worker is equally valuable even though they ultimately exist lower on the totem pole than other workers do. So there's this paradoxical existence that everybody who engages in this system has to cope with. And when you can design individuals to work within that system and believe that they're fulfilling some sort of deeper sense of duty because you've been able to trick their like higher level functions into believing that they should be doing this thing, you're going to end up with this weird kind of like profoundly nihilistic world, in my opinion, where it's kind of like everything is going to be given this like false sense of purpose, in the same way that like the Great Chain of Being gave people a false sense of purpose, because the point of it was, according to the individuals who were enforcing it, that like God has made things this way. And I think that one of Huxley's main like points to say is that it isn't God that made things this way, it's people who have made things this way. I don't think that a lot of, like, I'm sure that Nietzsche was an atheist, or at least a deist. I don't really know about his theological views, but if I had to guess, if he's agnostic in any capacity, as in he believes in a God at all, that ultimately his response, or his desire, is that humankind will take up the responsibility of ensuring that individuals are treated with value, not because we're obligated to treat them with value, but because we have chosen to give them value. And I think that this Huxley's book is kind of somewhat of a response to that, because what he's basically implying is that, like, well, we've given humans value, but only in the capacity of what it is that they can accomplish according to the needs of everybody around them. That's why everybody is, and I quote, everyone belongs to everyone. One other aspect of this book that we'll probably see more of is that there's no like long-term relationships. There's no marital relationships. And that is in part because of this idea that like sexuality is not a thing that has a possessive function any longer, because everyone belongs to everyone. Everyone's purpose is in these small little pockets of like small actions or large actions that ultimately adds up to the overall goal of humanity, which is dictated by people who are not participating in all those small little functions. They're existing someplace else. The alphas are not in the mines with the epsilons and things like that. And something else that was mentioned in these first two chapters that I'd just like to touch on before we wrap up is this idea that the company who is reproducing these humans is, in some capacity, I guess you could say, like, disappointed. I'm not entirely sure if that's the right phrase, but basically they are all very concerned with the idea of making humans mature faster while still having them accrue enough intelligence to be viable. So they're viewing maturity at like a sexual level and comparing it to things like elephants and other mammals that mature sooner. You know, an elephant matures at like 10 years, I want to say, and a couple other mammals they mentioned mature at 6 years. But humans, they say, don't mature completely until at least 13, if not 20. And so they're talking about, like, how is it that we are going to get our process faster? Because we've been able to speed the development of the body up, but the development of the mind is something that we haven't really got a grasp on just yet. And I think it's interesting and reflective of the time that Huxley would say, like, well, we've made all of these advancements now, and there's no way that they would have the advancements to know it then either. I think that there's something intrinsic to the aspect of what makes a person and what makes a person who they are and what makes a person an individual that Huxley is going to be trying to advocate for throughout this book. And that is going to be kind of like the part of the unknown, the faith-based aspect of the belief structure that the book is going to lay out for us. So I am really excited to talk about this book. It's been on my to-read list for ages. So looking forward to talking about it in the next couple of weeks. that's all I've got for you guys today. Really appreciate you listening. Hope that you enjoyed the podcast and that you're looking forward to talking more about Huxley and A Brave New World. I know that I am. Definitely check it out. If you have an Audible subscription, it's a free book on Audible, so really no reason for you not to check it out there. And then it's a book that's super easy to find. You can probably find it on Amazon for like $4. And if you want to support like a local bookstore, which we all should be doing in these trying times, is supporting local businesses because they're the ones that are getting hit really, really hard, then we should, then you should go out and grab a book from there because I'm, 90% sure they have it. Like I said, a lot of high schools read this, so there's a lot of copies circulating around. So thanks again for listening, everybody. Stay safe out there. I don't know about the situation in California as far as fires are concerned, but, I hope that everyone is safe and okay. There's definitely a lot of rough stuff going on, especially in the state that I live in, which is, again, California. So, yeah, we'll see you guys again on Sunday. Have a good rest of your week. Thanks for tuning in.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.